Yeah, activists want body cams removed because it exposes Black Lives Matter as hoaxes and lies. So let's go ahead and get into this video, shall we?
They have been an essential propaganda tool in convincing so many well-meaning people across our society that the authorities care about police violence, that they want accountability, that they're doing something right, and it distracts people from the core, important kinds of changes that we need, which is to reduce the size and power of these bureaucracies.
So what you just heard right there is an absolutely stunning admission from a left-winger who, by the way, wrote the book called Copaganda, this ridiculous book that says that, oh my god, the media is just propagandizing you into thinking that crime is bad and that police actually address criminality, actually saying on this Democracy Now! Interview that he doesn't like the existence of body cams because more times than not, guess what? The body cam ends up debunking the narratives that they were supposed to support, which is that the police are violent and out of control, and there's no justification for their actions. Now, of course, we know this to be true. I've done multiple videos where I actually juxtapose an image shown to us of a person shot by the police in the media versus how they looked on the body cam footage, whether they have a knife in their hand or they have those crazy eyes, that the body cams have been a godsend to police. But it's nice to see somebody who is on the other side of the issue, somebody who of course wants to take down police, admit the obvious, that transparency is the enemy of their agenda, and this is what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money, okay?
I came to this particular issue as a civil rights lawyer, fighting against the injustice and brutality of the whole punishment bureaucracy, so not just police, but also prosecutors and courts and jails and prisons, all of the unnecessary death and violence that happens in that system. And what was fascinating to me in the early years of my career, and then of course we saw it after 2020, is that no matter what kinds of injustice and brutality and violence and even murder this system visits on people, and particularly the most vulnerable people in our population, this violence almost never is ratcheted down. And I think what I started to be really interested in is, what are the stories that the system tells the public about itself in the wake of outrage over its own violence?
So look, obviously this guy is coming at this from an ideological point of view. He is of the belief that treating criminals like they're not innocent Beba Angel Aladdins is actually a big problem. It actually causes us to be bad as a society, and the one thing that we should never ever do is arrest, prosecute, and jail criminals, because it's not like it's been proven that incapacitation is the most effective way to reduce crime. What we need to do is give them welfare, I presume, or whatever ridiculous prescription that this guy has for these particular problems in our society, if he even acknowledges that they're problems in our society, which very likely he doesn't, because guess what? As I'm listening to this guy, I end up realizing that he's essentially the foundational base for a bunch of bad arguments that have been put forward against me in debates related to criminality, all of which I've debunked, refuted, and disputed in the past, and yet this guy is on Democracy Now! Crying about the fact that you can see what police are doing, and more times than not, it actually exonerates the police rather than condemning them.
In 2020, there was this movement in the wake of the killings, not just George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and many, many more. There was this movement to say, well, wait a second, how are we spending our resources as a society on safety? This is not the kind of safety that our society wants. And instead of actually examining those expenditures, society increased the amount of money that we threw into policing and to courts and jails and prisons. And in 2021, the year after George Floyd was killed, the police killed more people than they did in 2020, as you mentioned, and more people in 2022 than 2021.
So obviously this guy has a bad retelling of events, a bad retelling of history, because in reality, if you guys aren't aware, they actually did cut the police budget in a bunch of municipalities around the country post the backlash to George Floyd. This happened in New York City and a bunch of other municipalities around the nation, and this ended up resulting in the largest year-over-year homicide increase, 30% nationwide, 47% in the city of New York, and a bunch of other places saw much larger jumps in homicide. So the next year, you ended up in a situation where people were frantically trying to restore police funding. In addition to that, cutting the police budget actually ends up leading to an increase in crime, as we saw demonstrated in 2020. But in reality, you still need to field officers. So when you have fewer staff, what ultimately ends up happening is that you have to pay out more in overtime to your remaining staff. So the ineffectiveness of defund the police cannot be understated, because even in areas where they voted to defund their police department because they had to pay so much more in overtime to those that remained, because they actually cut the number of officers that they had, they ended up spending more money. So it did fail in every possible regard. But notice that he completely ghosts the fact that they did cut police funding. It led to a giant increase in crime, and then he starts talking about an increase in shootings, which again, I want you to take note of right now. I will address it in just a little bit, but it's absolutely crucial the way that this guy counts certain things versus other things.
The actual message that's being conveyed in Fox News and the New York Times on issues of crime and immigration are virtually identical. And that's what I show with chilling and sometimes I think kind of funny detail in the book Copaganda. And so it's very important to say a few things right up front. Despite what you've been told in Fox News and the New York Times, all crime in the United States that police track, and keep in mind, that's very important because police, prosecutors, prisons, they really only deal with crime committed by the most vulnerable people in our society. They are not investigating or prosecuting the biggest crimes in our society, like wage theft, which is $50 billion a year. So 5 times all of the property crime that police track combined, or tax evasion is $1 trillion a year, or air pollution, much of which is criminal, which kills 100,000 people. So 5 times all homicide combined. We're not talking about those crimes because those crimes are largely committed by wealthy and powerful institutions and individuals.
So this is one of the stupidest arguments before, and we've actually heard it repeatedly from the left wing, and I'm glad to know that at least one of the sources of this dumbass argument is this particular author, again, the author of Copaganda. So he makes the case that police departments, they don't deal with every crime, like wage theft, like air pollution, which are much more serious, way more serious than homicides. Therefore, we should never factor in the consequences of that criminality. However, obviously, we have the EPA to deal with actual air pollution. We have another agency called the Department of Labor that specifically addresses issues like wage theft. More on that $50 billion number in just a little bit, by the way. But the idea that we're not supposed to care about the crimes that police deal with because they're irrelevant, like murder, rape, robbery, sexual assault, all these other crimes, burglary, assault, all these other things that actually impact regular ordinary people, because remember, it's not just the criminals that are regular ordinary people, it's their victims that, again, are being victimized by these violent criminals because of these other things, is absurd on its face. But in addition to that, this scumbag actually is making the argument that, everybody in the media is doing propaganda against us, but that $50 billion number, that estimate that he's utilizing from the Economic Policy Institute, is a 2014 estimate. Why are you going so far back in time in order to talk about wage theft to find the biggest number, in order to compare and contrast that to, what's actually going on in terms of criminality? It seems like that's a little bit outdated. Now, if you guys will remember, I actually did a side-by-side from the Economic Policy Institute a couple of years ago, much more updated numbers, and according to them, the wage theft versus actual theft disparity was like $15.1 billion to 12 point something billion dollars, so it was much more narrow than was being portrayed by the serfs at the time, and nowhere near the $50 billion estimate, which, by the way, is in fact an estimate. And what's ridiculous about that $50 billion 2014 estimate is that it compares and contrasts to the actual discovered instances of wage theft in the United States of America back in 2012, and that number was $933 million. So the EPI, a left-wing organization, in 2014 decided that the number of wage theft dollars recovered was actually too low, so they put a 50x on it, put it in a headline, and 12 years later, you have this propagandist repeating that. Now look, there are obviously differences in methodology, which is the reason why you get that inflated $50 billion number that this propagandist is actually utilizing right here in order to deflect from criminality. But even if we just pretend that everything is all the same and squared away, how come we're talking about wage theft when it's gone down so much? I mean, he's about to make the argument in just a little bit that crime is down compared to historical averages, charges. Therefore, we shouldn't talk about criminality. We shouldn't talk about irrelevant things that are just us targeting poor people, like rape and murder and robbery and assault and all those crimes. That doesn't matter. Also, notice how he doesn't mention car theft and carjacking, which is up, not down. He says every crime is down, even though, again, that's not true. That's not based in reality. But we should look at the 2014 numbers when it's convenient, when he wants to deflect.
The crime that police track, even that narrow range of crime, which is focused on the most vulnerable people in our society, contrary to what you have been told in the news every single day for the last several years, is actually down. And not only is it down, it is at historic lows. Since we've been...
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. This fucking idiot, man. I swear to God. This dude is a fucking nut, man. You can tell the Democrats are fucked up in the head. They don't know the difference between high and low or anything like that. They just fucking idiotic. They don't know nothing. They just fucking stupid as hell. So yeah, it's just gotten out of this fucking thing. So yeah, it's got out of hand here, man. These Democrats don't know shit about nothing. It's just fucking crazy. I'm telling you, man. But people voted for the Democrat Party, even though they know the Democrats are going to screw them over. They promise them this and promise them that, promise them this and promise them that. But find out it's not true. And why is that? Because they just promise this and promise that, people get the votes. That's all it is. They just promising people shit, not even keeping the word. God dang it, people. Oh boy. So yeah, there's a lot of crazy shit going on. So let me get back to that video I was talking about. See where I can find it at. Oh, here we go. Right back here again. So let's go.
These 60-year lows. It's been going down almost every single year for the last 25 years. And yet, consumers of the mainstream news, especially consumers of New York Times, of MSNBC, of The Atlantic, these people, when you poll them, they actually believe crime is up.
So again, it's been going down almost every year for the last 25 years. Is extremely deceptive because we all know, I just talked about it, that homicide jumped in this country year over year 30%. It jumped again an additional 7%. Now, of course, it didn't reach levels that were like worse than the 1990s or the worst periods in American history, but obviously this was a significant jump, and we started to see a turnaround just a couple of years ago based on the fact that we were prosecuting more people. In fact, I've highlighted different cities that have seen the biggest turnarounds and how differences in policy, aka stop going soft on criminal like this guy wants, start prosecuting them, like in Baltimore where Ivan Bates started targeting repeat gun offenders, and as soon as he came into office, replacing the previous reformist district attorney, crime went down, and homicide in particular in Baltimore to historic lows. But again, this guy's like, oh no, in the long-term average, if we compare this to the 1990s and 1980s, it's basically been down every single year. But get a load of the fact that this guy, when he's talking about police shootings, can all of a sudden go back to 2020 and start counting from 2020.
In 2021, the year after George Floyd was killed, the police killed more people than they did in 2020, as you mentioned, and more people in 2022 than 2021.
So this guy won't tell you about the increase in crime, the increase in homicides, greatest year-over-year increase of all time in 2020, followed up by another 7% increase in 2021, and by the way, an additional increase in 2022, because, if you compare it to the historical over the last 25 years, historical averages, it's gone down almost all the years of the last 25 years, but then he narrows in on the post-2020 as if that's the starting point for when we started tracking police shootings, and he's like, look, they went up in the years following the 2020 Black Lives Matter riots. I mean, the George Floyd Floyd incident and the so-called reforms. But the thing is, obviously, if you're going to have more crime, you would have more police interactions, and thus you're likely to have more of those interactions going south via shootings, so that makes sense on its own. But again, the historical context is not given right here, because it turns out the number of unarmed people gunned down by the police is down compared to the historical average, but he takes no note of that. He isolates the variable after 2020 to say that it's up, it's higher than the previous year. Of course, he doesn't talk about unarmed people, which was the whole shtick back in the day. And in addition to that, when you actually do a breakdown of these unarmed people shootings, what you find out is that many of them were going for the police officer's gun, so in the act of arming themselves, or they were driving their car at the police, which is not counted as being armed. And by the way, speaking of misperceptions, do you guys remember this 2019 survey that found that very liberal people are the most likely to overestimate the amount of unarmed people shot and killed by the police? 31% of very liberal people think that 1,000 people or more are shot by the police. 14.9% of them think it's about 10,000. And of course, you have 7.8% of them thinking that it's over 10,000. These numbers are absolutely ridiculous, especially considering the fact that the number in the year that they were asking about was 13. So about 10 is the correct answer, and yet people have this great misperception about this that the guy who's the author of Copaganda never wants to talk about it. Gee, I wonder why.
These fallacies are not just some accidental kind of one-off mistake people are making. They are consistent year in, year out, and they are the product of carefully cultivated propaganda.
Why does the guy who's the author of Copaganda use all these outdated and cherry-picked statistics in order to make all of his points? It could be because he's a propagandist.
So you have to ask yourself, in the wake of outrage over police violence, why are so many public officials, particularly Democrats, pushing body cameras? I mean, after all, the person who shot Renee Good filmed himself in that interaction. What we know from all of the data is that there was a moment where the police were so desperate to get body cameras, so were prosecutors. They badly wanted them to dramatically increase their surveillance capacities, to link to facial recognition software. There was billions of dollars at stake in cloud computing contracts for the tech industry and the surveillance policing industry. Prosecutors wanted them so they could prosecute in higher volume, low-level cases against the most vulnerable people in our society. There were all these reasons they wanted for crowd control. You're seeing now with ICE when they go to out in the street, they have these cameras, they scan the crowd, they're mapping people's faces. The policing industry wanted body cameras. They wanted them so badly that before they got public funding for them, they were getting private donations from people like Steven Spielberg because they were so desperate to get these cameras.
So this is absolute nonsense in every possible way. You can look at the record. Police unions were against body cameras. They thought it was an invasion of privacy, and they essentially did everything in their power in order to prevent them from being put into place, yet leftist activists insisted that this would reveal all of the police violence, and it turns out this was a monkey paw's wish of epic proportion because it actually ended up vindicating the police. Horrible mistake by the police union to be opposed to it. Horrible mistake by these people who want to lie about police to be in favor of it. But this guy tries to flip it on his head and says, actually, we knew all along that the body cams were going to show the opposite. And maybe he did because he knew he was lying all along. But again, look at the way that this guy goes through this logic.
Something happened after the killing of Michael Brown. Prominent Democrats like Barack Obama, Eric Holder, many local mayors and governors, they came together and they said, we should pitch body cameras as not as something the police want, which hasn't worked. We haven't been able to get those body cameras. So the companies got together at the Obama administration and they decided to shift their marketing strategy. They decided to shift to, instead of marketing as something that were good for the police and the police wanted, they said in the wake of Michael Brown, we'll market it to low information people in the public, to well-meaning liberal people. We'll market it as accountability and transparency. And so they totally shifted, and then they were able to get